Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Vaizey View. This is the podcast where I scratch my itch about the mix between technology and public policy, and I try and interview people who have got something interesting to say about this nexus. I go to different countries, virtually, of course, like France or the Netherlands or Estonia, to talk about their policies. I take deep dives into particular sectors like agri-tech or cybersecurity, and I speak to thinkers about tech, and sometimes I speak to politicians, generally ex-politicians like Tony Blair and Malcolm Turnbull. But I'm delighted today to welcome Theo Blackwell, who is the Chief Digital Officer for London. And there are lots of reasons why I want to talk to Theo, and there are lots of reasons why talking to him right now is good timing, because my last podcast was with Saul Klein, who talked about how where his firm Local Globe is based, he thinks could be the new Palo Alto. And that place is Camden, where indeed our guest Theo was a councillor for many, many years. So he will know Saul and what is happening in the new Palo Alto extremely well. The other reason it's good timing is because I am an arch procrastinator. So when I should have been preparing for this interview, I was scrolling through Twitter last night and I came across an article by a woman called Julie Samuel, who heads up something called Tech NYC, which is what it does on the tin. It campaigns for joined up tech policy for New York City. And she was calling for a deputy mayor for tech, basically saying New York needs a Theo Blackwell. Even more amusingly, I couldn't actually read the article because it was blocked because of GDPR, but that is a whole other conversation to have. And the third reason, without wishing to sound too weird and creepy, that I want to interview Theo is that I really want his job. And I noticed that he has exactly the same degree as me, modern history from the University of Oxford. So clearly, I don't need to be some techie who started coding at the age of 5, although we may find out that Theo did indeed code from the age of 5 to do the outstanding job that I think Theo is doing, which you're going to find out from this podcast, because there's lots of innovation going on in London. I should stress, by the way, that London has a Labour mayor who's just been re-elected. I'm a Conservative, but this podcast is above party politics. I'm interested in finding out what Theo's been doing, and I suspect if a Tory mayor had been elected, he or she might well have followed very similar policies. The fact is, London needs a Theo. Theo, welcome to the podcast.
Well, it's great to be here today, Ed. Thank you for the introduction.
Brilliant. Now tell us, so I started with my creepy thing about how I wanted your job. How did you come to be the Chief Digital Officer? Because you have followed a sort of public policy career, but you don't necessarily have a huge tech background, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting story about how London came to this point, and actually where you started with New York calling for more leadership in the digital space. The idea originated from Mayor Bloomberg's New York, where they appointed the first chief digital officer to oversee their strategic digital transformation and engagement with their tech sector, because they felt they were being kind of outcompeted by Silicon Valley. And they said, well, why don't we have massive tech clusters in New York? And we've got better restaurants and a cultural offer and all of these other things that Palo Alto apparently doesn't. So Tech UK, this tech sector lobbying group, London First, a couple of interested councils got together, coordinated by Bloomberg Philanthropies, to craft what a chief digital officer would look like for London. That was in 2015. And one of the principal things they wanted to solve is that obviously the UK's got a very federated local government structure, and London is at once, you've got big institutions like TfL who've got a real track record of Transport for London, that have a real track record of smart city initiatives right across the city. And they've done congestion charge, which is arguably one of the first modern smart city initiatives, contactless payment. And then on the other hand, you've got these 32 boroughs, each with their own innovation record. And that presents quite a confusing picture to the tech clusters that have been growing in London over the last decade. So could we find some strategic leadership in City Hall to bring that together, to maximize benefits for citizens and create the opportunities for growth? So that in a nutshell is the reason for a chief digital officer for London.
And how did you come to get the role, Theo?
Well, there was a open process of appointment. I put myself forward because I sort of brought two things to the game. One is I was in London local government, so I understood it. I was in London Borough of Camden, and I'd seen the transformation of Holborn and King's Cross and actually Camden Town into significant tech clusters. And we were thinking as a council at the time, how do we take advantage of this, meet needs of residents, and also bring more technology and more innovation into the council? And in my day job, because councillors often have other interests apart from what they do in the evenings and on the weekends and the rest of their life, I worked for the video games industry. So I was also seeing how data was transforming the games industry, overtaking film and music, and seeing how that was really, creating products and services that were just improving the enjoyment and experience of people. So I was seeing data from two sides, really. I was seeing data in transforming the council and data also in a commercial sphere. So I thought I had the that was basically my pitch. And and one of the things you mentioned in your introduction, which was the establishment of the London Office of Technology and Innovation, was something that I'd been working on. And I said, actually, this is what London needs.
Brilliant. Well, we're gonna drill into the detail like Loti and other things, but just give us a kind of step back overview of your kind of approach. I mean, to a certain extent, you have in terms of how the position of Chief Digital Officer came about. But when you approach any kind of issue that's a tech issue that we're going to drill into, kind of what is your thinking and your approach about how you approach it? You talk about in some of your interviews, for example, which the government digital service talks about as well. What is the user need? Just give us your elevator pitch.
Yeah, so I've been heavily influenced by sort of generation one of the government digital service. I thought that was a remarkable innovation by the government at the time, and
amazing.
The work of Mike Bracken, Tom Loosemore, and team on establishing those principles of how you should design technology around user need, and that almost is in direct contrast to that idea of technology, smart cities is a kind of top-down thing. It's actually built up from user needs. So really my in terms of my elevator pitch is that how can we bring that user design tradition into where I think it applies most appropriately, the products and services that are experienced by citizens on the ground, and most of them in the United Kingdom actually experienced via local government rather than national government. So I come from that tradition. So our approach is essentially champion user-centered design, get better with data, fix the plumbing on connectivity, invest in talent and skills, and also create those institutions that are needed for collaboration. That 5-step approach underlines what London is doing in phase 1 of our Smarter London work.
I should have written that down because then you've given me the agenda for the rest of the podcast. But luckily, I have done a bit of research in between surfing Twitter. So let's start with what I call the boring stuff, but it's actually essential. And there are kind of two sides to this debate, or two angles to this debate. The first is obviously you can't do anything digitally unless you've got great broadband in London. And counterintuitively, there are some parts of London which still don't have fantastic broadband. What is your kind of input into, frankly, getting the fibre under the roads to properties in London?
Well, I mean, as you'll know from your own experience in government, it's sort of easier said than done to transition from that kind of copper legacy that London is built on, which has supported the growth of our technology sector to a certain point, but it really needs to be fixed if we're going to make that leap through into 5G and then beyond. So first of all, we needed to, I think the government calls it barrier bust, I'd say reduce the friction, promote investment in London through making it easier for telcos to dig up roads right across the city. So we've put in that human resource so that all of those administrative hurdles, if you jump over borough boundaries, are sorted out. And we've also created consistent ways of doing things, sort of legal agreements called way leave. So these are all kind of like really sort of complicated, rather non-headline things that are really important actually for CEOs of companies if they want to invest in your area. And secondly, we've made a really major play using Transport for London, who are in the midst of negotiating a concession, which is laying hundreds of kilometers of fiber using tunnels and ducting and buildings, public buildings identified by London's 32 boroughs, to create a fiber backbone for London so that that last mile dig for infrastructure providers can be filled with copper, filled with fiber rather than copper, and we can solve the problem of underserved areas being served.
So this fiber background was originally is for the tube. It's for the signaling system, isn't it?
Yeah, it's for the mobile connectivity, and it's linked with the emergency services network. It's now providing a mobile signal on tube. So when I was in seeing the newly re-elected Mayor of London, I made a phone call for the first time to my partner on the Jubilee line. Now that technology of providing the mobile signal also provides the fiber, and so what we've done is essentially provide that backbone and then link that to hubs around tube stations in the network, so that London now has that coverage. And of course, this is important for the future because 5G is not standalone technology. It needs that full fiber to be in place to take the next step. So this is what we call Connected London program. It essentially is fixing the plumbing, the modern plumbing of London.
So I think that is amazing because, funny enough, I was on the Jubilee line on Tuesday night going to the Brits, risking my life, obviously, for others in order to show that live events can work. And I remember, it's quite interesting what a kind of bugbear this has been, being able to get a signal on the underground, because I was underground on the Jubilee line and I suddenly noticed I had a 5G signal. I said, something has changed. But the other thing when I read about this, which really annoyed me about what you've done, is because I discovered when I was the broadband minister that Network Rail had laid 10,000 kilometers of dark fiber, and try as I might, I could not get them to open it up to, it would have been perfect for rural areas. And it was
Absolutely
just such a good example of how people build this infrastructure in silos. They've spent £1 billion on this fiber, and as far as I'm aware, it's useless for broadband, and yet you've gone and done it with the tube. It's so annoying.
Well, it also raises money for TfL as well, because it's a concession. So that's, they will raise substantial amounts of money to reinvest back into the tube system. So I think, cities need to be really active in their digital approach, because the new things that we need to provide connectivity, fiber and 5G, you essentially need assets to put them in. Who has most of the assets in the city? Well, in one shape or another, government and the public sector.
I'll tell you one thing just quickly, is whether or not you think councils, I mean, obviously don't want to lead you into trouble, but whether councils, local councils really do get it, because I was told a story, which I think is true, that for 5G masts, for example, you can put them on lampposts, but in one borough, the lamppost people said to the infrastructure people, you're not putting a mast on our lampposts. There are lampposts. Our job is to look after lampposts. They're lampposts. They're not mobile phone masts. Does there need to be sort of more joining up at the sort of borough level for people to realize that this is going to benefit everyone, and you've got to work together to make this happen?
Well, I mean, I think government's created quite a permissive environment for the putting up of mobile masts, and in local democracy, I think it's legitimate for people to say, I don't want something that despoils or reduces the amenity of my area, makes it more cluttered. But that's why we've put in a team of people that, on the one hand, links with the telcos, but also with the boroughs themselves, so that we can just smooth through some of these issues. And I think, it's a funny thing to say when you look at a council, but often one of the most difficult things a council has to do is that I've encountered with connectivity is you were trying to lay a piece of fibre that goes through some housing land across a main road run by TfL, past a private estate, and up a lamppost. You're suddenly talking to about 8 different professionals.
Yeah, it's a nightmare.
And I certainly think that that the council's absolutely been on a journey on this. We're in a much better place now where councils realise the potential that connectivity can bring to the area than they were perhaps when you were minister. And part of the challenge is saying it's in everybody's interests that we get more connected, and takes a lot of explaining. But I think we've definitely made progress.
So the other angle on this, you deliver the fantastic fibre, but there is the digital divide is also obviously income related, skills related. So you also want to kind of bring much more digital inclusion to London. What are you trying to do to help, low income families access broadband and that kind of thing?
Well, one of the main programs in what's called the recovery program for London, for our city to build back better after the crisis, it's called Digital Access, and I lead that. And that brings together the program we've just discussed, plus London's responsibility as of September last year to provide skills for Londoners, devolved powers to us. So we've got an entitlement for every adult to have basic digital skills training if they have low or no digital skills. So that's freely available from your local college. And I think what the crisis showed us as well was that there were tens of thousands of children who couldn't learn online. There are very, very many older people who didn't have a device or an affordable connection. And I think the challenge for us, and you'll know this as your time as a minister, is that a lot of it's really easy to express sort of concern over this, because we can say a third of this group is underserved, or there's a particular problem with this cohort. But we've never really treated digital inclusion like a service and say, if you present yourself to a GP surgery, council customer service centre, or a voluntary group that's supported by the corporate sector to get people digitally included, how do we triage that need and say, yeah, okay, you can have free skills over here, or maybe we can find a way to upcycle a device and get you a device. And I think one of the challenges for the corporate sector with digital access, because there are a whole host of really good initiatives from businesses, is that they quite often, and during the crisis, certainly the case, came up with offers saying, well, we will give you free dongles and low-cost connections if you tell us who needs them. And we weren't able to tell. We had real trouble receiving that offer and giving it to those actual individuals, because we're still dealing with it at too abstract a level. So what we want to do is basically find a way to triage that need, so when someone presents themselves, they can get what they need in order to have a more fulfilling experience online. Now, that's a fairly difficult ask, but I don't think we can carry on like this, where we're just expressing concern and not being very effective at delivering that.
I think that's a brilliant point. I mean, I think it was always my problem that it felt too abstract,
Mm.
the kind of digital divide. You didn't really know what it meant, and to a certain extent, I took a maybe it was a slightly crude view that particularly, lots of people were, particularly obviously young people, able to kind of adapt and find their way through. But kind of understanding what the problem is, who genuinely needs help, and also providing access points like a GP surgery, for example, to people to say, well, actually, or encouraging GPs to ask people to say, well, actually, you can go. There's one front door you can walk through if you've
Right.
got gaps in your either skills or your infrastructure and your equipment. I'm sort of hopping about a bit here, but I've got a lot of things I want to talk to you about. So I now want to move very clunking through the gears from digital inclusion to data. And I'm very excited by the London data store. And it's got it is like a store because it's got quite a lot of things in it. And there's an element, I think, again, just as the pandemic highlighted the digital divide and the need for genuine leaning in on digital inclusion and knowing who needs the help and what help they need. I think your thesis is that COVID, more than anything, highlighted the need for great data, and that you kind of leaned into the data sources in order to give yourself real-time information about the impact that COVID was having on London, particularly on its economy. So talk us through, I think it was called the Odysseus Project. Talk us through.
Yeah. So London's had a data platform for about 10 years, starting with that kind of great shift in 2010 on open data. So it has a central register of where quite a lot of the official data is and public sector data is in London. And in times of a crisis, or when you're developing a really big program, for example, on the environment or the economy, open data only gets you so far. What you need is the ability to share secure data safely. And as we've been developing the city data platform, we've kind of advanced the view of open data into the idea of shareable and secure data as well. So the data store now contains this platform where we share a lot of data which has some form of sensitivity around us between parties. And when the crisis happened, there was the not unreasonable ask from city leaders, tell us what was going on in the economy. And if we just relied on government open data sets, we'd kind of know what was happening on a monthly level. It would have been not very useful to know what was going on actual high streets, of which we have 600 in London. It just it's just too slow. And of course, these city leaders were also getting like reams, after a while, reams of public health information. So there's a real sort of, difference between what you're seeing happening health-wise and then on the economy. The data sets really weren't there. So we partnered with the LionTree Institute, a research institute, Microsoft UK, and our own team at the data store to pivot an existing project which was measuring air quality in London using artificial intelligence derived from TfL's network of 900 cameras to measure the busyness of London streets. So that used the camera network to take snapshots in time to say, here's how many cars and here's an estimate of pedestrians on given streets, and feed it into other data sources. We then talked to mobile phone company O2 and MasterCard, provider of spending data, to bring that together so we could have an idea about movement and spending at certain times of the day in various parts of the city. So that is now plugged into the decision-making process, where we can direct funds, hopefully more effectively. And I suppose, you've been in a leadership position. It's just like that confidence that when you have the data, you can make bolder decisions. And that was the aim of the project. And so for the first time, we've been able to bring together open data sets and private data sets that we might have used individually all together at once.
I think that is really fascinating, actually, for reasons I wasn't quite expecting, because I hadn't appreciated that you were sort of taking shots on the high street and using mobile phone data to kind of work out, where is everyone, as it were. And I remember once being told by the head of a supermarket, and they were, in my view, quite right. If the chancellor wants to know what's happening in the UK economy, he should talk to the head of every supermarket every week, because they will tell you 6 weeks before whether there's a recession on the way. And
Right.
what I think is fascinating as well is that I read in Mark Carney's book, I'm hoping to do a podcast with him shortly. He was talking about how you lend to small businesses, and he said you kind of have to upend, in the digital age, you should upend your thinking, and you should say, look at this small business's social media presence. Has it got, it may have no revenue, but has it got 100,000 followers, that kind of thing. So what I love about, what I'm getting to is, surely this now changes your view. Well, you made it happen, but this is not just for COVID. This is forever. You can monitor London's economy in real time, and you can onboard more and more technology as it comes on stream. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, and that's ultimately the aim of this, is to provide more active insights for policymakers. This project is morphed into something we call the High Streets Data Partnership, and so you can imagine things like councils looking at some of the regulations they lay down, whether they need them or not, whether specific high streets are doing well or not, and some interesting findings can come from that. Whether you have a DIY warehouse at the end of one high street could mean that some high streets are doing better because there's more footfall during the crisis than not. What's the impact on the central activity centre, the centre of town, where there was so much of a cultural offer, and intuitively that it would take a hit, but again, you could look at it almost street by street on what needs to happen, and of course I think there's some wider applications here that we're exploring. So the government and Transport for London agreed a programme on low traffic neighbourhoods. So what's the relationship between pedestrian build outs and cycle friendly areas and the local economy? So these things support, not just for crisis, but actually support our conception of London as we look forward.
So I'm not going to go down a rabbit hole of how you can use data to plan your roadworks better, but I want to move on to the the London Office of Technology and Innovation kind of takes this down one step, if you like, because you've talked earlier about borough leadership and coordinating the boroughs, certainly on infrastructure and broadband rollout. But the London Office of Technology Innovation is, I think, 16 boroughs that are leaning into tech, coming together under your leadership, under City Hall's leadership, to work on issues, look at opportunities.
Yes, and we established that.
You're looking at me like I've got it wrong, or I don't know.
No. It's that's exactly what it does. No, and
I suddenly panicked, looked at my notes.
Its aim was to solve that challenge that was set to us by the tech sector and some of the boroughs in 2015. That London had a collaboration deficit. It's not just London, actually. It's just there's a challenge right across the UK government about how do you get councils to work together, essentially providing the same services across administrative boundaries. Exactly. You can't. You can pass all the laws you want, but then in practice, there needs to be a kind of community of interest and a shared purpose. And like the old model of kind of saying, you should just all share services is just like, administratively cumbersome, over legalistic, and probably is good if you want to do something simple. But what if you want to experiment on use of Internet of Things to care for older people, or do a punt on a risky project? Those are top heavy vehicles. We need something that's lighter and more adaptive to get councils to work together, not just because they're next to each other, is, Croydon and Camden might come together on a certain project because they've got shared interests. So our aim was to create something more adaptable. So we've got a team of data people and team of designers based at London councils, funded by us, funded by membership of these 19 boroughs now. It's grown.
Oh, cool.
And they do shared projects together. So
For those
they
not
look
familiar with London, just quickly, that's about half the boroughs of London.
That's right, yeah. So 32 boroughs in London, so 19 now. So that's, a very significant chunk of London. I know population of about 5 million in total in governed population by these 19 boroughs. And so their technologists and their designers get together and say, okay, what are the things that actually we're thinking of doing or we're doing that we could do together? And we've adopted those GDS principles, government digital service design principles. They all have to use those principles in order to be a member of London Office of Technology and Innovation, and so that we can do things collectively. And so I think the outcome of this is that London technology, public service technology, has actually been a really exciting place to be. We've attracted more people who used to be at government digital service centrally and now chief digital officers of councils.
Oh, that's interesting. Yes, I wondered what it was that was pulling them back in.
Yeah, they've come to London. So Greenwich and
exactly.
and Croydon have people who CDO of Croydon was behind gov.uk, Neil Williams. So we've created a place where the talent comes, and also some really exciting projects that we've been looking at. Some of them are kind of fix the plumbing stuff necessary to go further, and other ones are looking at how we embed things like, as I mentioned, Internet of Things with devices with older people, doing data projects to sort out our electric vehicle charging infrastructure. These are all like the really necessary things that also says to the market and the tech sector, hey, come and play in London, come and invest here, because we're getting rid of all that friction that you might have perceived as being in the way, and also providing that front of door for you to have a conversation.
That's brilliant. That is absolutely brilliant. And again, just as there are two angles to the infrastructure and digital inclusion, there's also an angle here, which is London Office of Technology and Innovation bringing boroughs together to do some difficult but important work. But there's also the Civic Innovation Programme, which is the other side of it, which is getting startups involved in coming up with interesting and exciting ideas for the public good.
So
I think they're looking at things like housing, countering extremism, other things.
Yeah, one of the big problems, I think, with public service innovation, dealing with the tech community around us, public sector sometimes isn't very good at explaining what the problem is that needs to be solved. And you will have experienced this in central government, and certainly no different in local government. We've got a kind of stakeholder language. Maybe it's a little bit abstract. We intuitively know what the problem is, but when explaining it to kind of real world people who run businesses, the problem to be solved isn't as clear. And so, the combination of these new sort of institutions that we've put together and those design principles have enabled us to say, in a sense, train people to come together and say, this is the problem that we need to solve, so that we can get that kind of array of problem solvers from startups and scale ups to come in and help us. So the approach is known as an open call approach or open innovation approach, which your listeners from other cities will be aware of. And so what we started with is we piloted a program. We've had a round of cohorts, everything from trialing curbside electric vehicle charging. So, bits of the curb you can plug your car into, your electric vehicle into, to working with the Metropolitan Police to combat online extremism, as you say, which is now the product that spun out of that is now a national service. So people can confidently and confidentially report their concerns about online extremist content that they or their family members encounter. to our early stages of like 3D modeling and planning to support the housing system. So that program is now it was successful, and in two ways actually. One is it did actual things, so we got good products and services that came from it, and the engagement with the tech sector was brilliant. And secondly, by bringing public servants together, even if they didn't choose that product or it didn't win in the end, the journey that they went on made them think, actually, I could use this approach on something else. So it has that indirect byproduct of like opening the minds, challenging silos in the public sector so that we can more actively engage that kind of fantastic resource of the tech community around us. So this program is now part of our recovery program. And there's actually an open set of open calls out at the moment that people can see on the Mayor of London's website. It's called Challenge London. And we're looking to do the same thing for the priorities set out by London councils and Mayor of London to build back better.
Fantastic. And overlaying all of this work that you're doing, I was interested to find out about the emerging tech charter. So, as I understand it, again, trying to read your expression, you're doing all this incredible digital work, but you've also you out for consultation put forward an ethical charter, which is about how you deploy tech in a big city like London, the kind of ethical principles that it should follow.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The first week I joined the Mayor of London, the Uber dispute between the mayor and Uber and TfL, I should say, and Uber came to pass, and it was really interesting because in a sense that was sort of like some of the reaction to that was what I would classify as pre-techlash. It was sort of saying, sort of, what are you doing laying down rules or enforcing rules? Sort of let 1,000 flowers bloom. And, I think we've just traveled quite a long way since then. And it's, soon after that, there was a big challenge put to the city of Toronto about what Sidewalks Lab were proposing.
Oh yes,
and
the Google project.
On building a part of the city, as they said, from the internet up. And I think there is a, and we've had GDPR put in place in the UK data protection law
there's ongoing
since then.
About facial recognition.
Yeah. And so so I think that we need a way to structure and inform discussions about emerging technologies so that cities are kind of like at once a home to technologies, but not caught on the hop when they suddenly drop in our streets and in our public services. So the Emerging Tech Charter is essentially a guide to innovators and public servants, and transparent to the public on how we'd like to see technology trialed and deployed ultimately. And it's learning the lessons from the things that we've done, whether it's Transport for London or the Metropolitan Police with live facial recognition technology, saying, well, you should communicate with the public openly. You should have a way for them to communicate back to you. There should be a way in which you show the legal basis for what you're doing, and you should be transparent about what you do. And one of the key principles of the Emerging Tech Charter, which we've designed with innovators and we've talked to citizens and their elected representatives about, is that the legal obligation to do a data impact assessment, which is part of the law, and the ICO encourages you to publish this openly. There's a role for City Hall to provide a place for that. And so going back to our discussion about the data store, is that we can provide a home for people's data protection impact assessments so they can be in the open and transparent. And I think transparency lends itself towards good practice. What we don't want is, if something blows up with technology, quick, as we saw with the NHS app, people quite often say, well, where's your data protection impact assessment? And and the institution is seen as sort of like having been forced to publish it, as opposed to right from the outset saying, look, this is what we're doing, might involve a trade-off. Here's the legal basis, and here's our thinking. Go. And I think I think we need to bring technology more out into the open, because the challenge from most Londoners, they're willing to accept a trade-off with technology that might bring them benefit, but they've got a legitimate concern about black box technology or things that aren't clear to them. There's no reason why there can't be clear statements about what technology does and what principles have been involved. And that's really what lies behind the Emerging Technology Charter, of creating a consistent process of bringing this out into the open so we can have a discussion. Yes, there'll be challenge, but at least there's a clear set of principles behind it.
I'm glad I've sort of semi-ended on that note, because I think, hearing you explain what you're doing in such clear terms, I mean, it's one of those things where, and I started in sort of facetious manner that every city needs a Theo, but of course, every city does need a chief digital officer. And the fact that, I think out of your role, as it were, has emerged this emerging tech charter. You think now, with technology coming at us so fast and impacting us in so many ways as citizens, as opposed to consumers, not having some kind of tech charter. In fact, I don't even know if the British government has a kind of tech charter about how tech should be deployed by the national government. Seems so obvious and important, but I think it only comes about because there is your role focused on this. And I started by saying, I don't know if does New York still have a chief digital officer?
Yeah. John Farmer. Yeah.
They want to upgrade to a deputy mayor. But I wanted to end by thinking about what cities you admire. So you're doing this incredible work in London. Are there other cities that you look at saying, I want to be like them one day, they're ahead of us, or hello to my neighbor here, they're doing very similar things to us? I mean, I think Paris, for example, has come quite a long way. You mentioned Toronto. Are there any other cities that you think,
well,
a bit more money or a bit more flexibility, I'd like to do what they're doing?
Yeah, we work really closely with the city of Helsinki.
Interesting.
Their CDO.
So that wasn't a name I was expecting, so that's good.
Yeah, so they have a really pragmatic and progressive view of the use of technology. They've just been through a big city hall reform. They appointed a CDO, Mikko Rusama, and we do quite a lot of work on them, thinking about things like the Emerging Tech Charter and AI ethics. Similarly, City of Amsterdam and Ger Baron, who's the Chief Digital Officer there. City of San Francisco, first to do an Emerging Tech Charter, slightly different powers to us because they've got the power of giving permits. That gives us like leverage on the tech sector. But Carrie Bishop, who is a Brit, who's the CDO there, we've learned a lot of lessons from. And other than that, actually, we've got a very strong network through Horizon Europe, which is the European Commission funded program, which we are still in. And we've worked extremely closely with the city of Milan on deploying smart city technologies in neighborhoods. And so we hope those kind of relationships will continue. We are invested in those relationships continuing over time, because things that are scaled well, or things that are invented well in London through those links, can be scaled in other European cities. Because broadly speaking, we have got the same approach to it, same laws. And so, we're very hopeful for the future. These you locate yourself in London, you work with us on city improvements. That also creates markets elsewhere in Europe in particular.
Brilliant. Well, Theo, thank you so much. That was a brilliant tour de force. I mean, it's interesting, all the amount of work that's being done, and yet technology did not feature really at all in the mayoral campaign. It's not really a kind of political issue that, apart from broadband connectivity, it's not a massive political issue. And yet, in my view, I mean, I'm obsessed by it, because I keep saying to government ministers, you really leaned into the government digital service, you could in 4 years make more difference to citizens' lives than any amount of kind of front page headline policy initiatives. I mean, it's just so
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I totally agree with that. Yeah.
brilliant. We're on a note of agreement. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks a lot.